Hello everyone, my name is Elizabeth Gambino. I'm a professor of visual arts at Bard High School Early College in Baltimore. I am lucky enough to be serving as a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow this year with National Geographic and Lindblad expeditions. As part of my fellowship, I was able to go on expedition with Lindblad to Southeast Alaska. And while there on site, I was inspired by the approach to conservation, which was established through monument system in Alaska. And so, as part of my follow-on lesson, I decided to work with the National Geographic Learning Framework to create a lesson with Google Tour Builder, which allowed me to share the impact of monuments on conservation and the meaning that monuments add to society. Using materials gathered on expedition, I created a tour builder on the nature of monuments, covering both the monuments here closer to home in Washington, D.C., and those that I saw on site in Southeast Alaska. I start with Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve. The key learning questions here are whether a site itself can be a monument, and how the preservation of sites can lead to the honoring of diverse histories. And so, as we explore the totems on site here, I'm asking my students to consider whether objects themselves can preserve memory, and whether the installation of the objects in situ has more meaning or a different meaning than objects that are isolated in museums. Does a monument depend on the site itself, or can monuments be relocated to other sites in order to recollect important cultural experiences and events? Moving to the village of Petersburg in Alaska, we have a beautiful site which is in use regularly as a town center. This is a monument to fishermen who have lost their lives at sea. There is a replica of a Norwegian fisher boat, and this is the Sons of Norway Hall. One thing that is really important to consider is how this site represents the cultural heritage that is specific to Petersburg. Petersburg has a very large Norwegian contingent of settlers and is also representing people that participate in folkways and lifestyles in the village, which perspectives are represented and which are underrepresented in our cultural history. In my next site, moving to Admiralty Island, I am revisiting the question that was initiated with my experience at Glacier Bay, which is whether natural features themselves can be monuments. Is it the site itself? Is it the use of the site or the history of the site that creates the monumental status? In addition, I look at the temporality of monuments on my way back to Baltimore, stopping in Seattle, to consider whether monuments are sorts of time capsules and must be tied to the time of their creation, or whether they are more relevant to the time that they depict. Does a monument represent the time that it was erected, or does it really represent the time that is symbolized by the monument itself? Who is usually represented with monuments and memorials? Asking questions about gender, power, race, class, and status, we examine whether monuments are more powerful when they are monuments to a single individual or to groups, whether the monuments are more powerful and impactful when they are representational or abstract, and who is currently recognized most often in our cultural history. Are there particular events that are more often recognized as worthy of monumentalization? And how does design impact the interaction of the audience with the site? How can we make monuments and memorials more inclusive? How can we create more diversity in representation? My students were invited to create tours, a tour that explored monuments to groups that were or underrepresented in the cultural lexicon, as well as considering various themes across different cultures. They were required to have at least 3 sites in 3 different locations for their tour. One of the most interesting iterations was a look at monuments in the Caribbean to those in the Negritude movement or the movement for liberation. In particular, this provided a really exciting example of various formats and representations of heroes within the Black community who may be under-recognized in America. Other students decided to look at a more non-conventional approach. I had one student create a tour builder that looked at approaches to storytelling and fairy tales and imaginary characters and who's represented throughout Europe. Particularly interesting was her analysis of which stories were represented and how our construction of cultural stories helps to create the values that we then transmit to future generations. Another student examined monuments to Native Americans and consider how we should recognize these groups as a very important part of our cultural heritage. Another student considered African American women and how they could be recognized more in public monuments, comparing as well a transatlantic approach, examining statues in England as well as in America. Students used contemporary sculptures as well as historic sculptures, and at the end of the unit chose an actual site in Baltimore to propose and submit a request for a quote to the Baltimore Office of Promotion of the Arts, proposing a new monument that could be erected on that site.